I've kind of flagged that, and yeah, we'll see how people go. Right, so it's...
I just realised that it didn't say I was broadcasting, so we had to click broadcast to let people in. So I've done that now.
Fine.
So that should be okay.
And it will be recording as well now.
Yeah, as soon as you hit broadcast.
Technologies that are available and accelerate the deployment and development of them. So there's some technologies that are mature and or demonstrated, so either completely ready to go in the market or very close to. And then there's emerging technologies that are still in kind of the research development phase. In these cases, what we really need to see is over the next 10 years, bringing those technologies to market, ready to go, so that then from 2030 onwards, they're ready to go and can just be deployed. So that's sort of where we're at with technological process, and I'll talk through different things that fit in those categories. So I mentioned at the beginning that this piece of work is an update on work that was done in 2014. One of the most interesting, really remarkable things is how much has changed in this space since we did that work back in 2014. The most remarkable side of things is in renewables and batteries used for electricity generation. So solar installations achieved a price reduction in 5 years that was meant to take, or estimated to take, 20 years. And in terms of larger scale generation of electricity, the cost of new wind and solar, even with hours of storage attached, is now unequivocally lower than the cost of new coal generation. Batteries have followed a similar route. So batteries are needed to store electricity that's generated. Costs have decreased very fast. They're 80% cheaper than they were in 2010, and this is much quicker than we expected. And what this has allowed, in one example, is a boom in electric vehicles. There's now 3 million electric cars on the road, and expectations are that EVs will be the same price, if not cheaper, than petrol vehicles within 5 years. And 5 years ago, we never would have imagined that to have happened that quickly. And what's also really exciting is we've seen a lot of progress in sectors or things that emit a lot of emissions that were seen as really hard to abate. So those emissions, we just couldn't see a way to get rid of them without massively scaling back activity or totally changing. This is in things like heavy transport, large industry, and things like beef production. So, for example, cement and steel, we're seeing ways now in which to reduce emissions. And we're also seeing kind of these new innovative solutions such as cross-laminated timber that can be used to build buildings without the need of cement and steel, or much less. For example, in Brisbane, there's a 10-story office tower built fully from timber. And the other one is beef production that I mentioned. There's kind of two things that are happening. One is we're starting to see what are called anti-methane vaccines and other solutions, which is ways in which to stop essentially livestock, cows and others from burping and farting methane that's terrible for the atmosphere. Those were very much nascent, not ready to go 5 years ago, and now we're really seeing some progress there. And we're also seeing alternatives, things like plant-based protein substitutes and things like that, that we're seeing a real shift in food use. So what's there on the screen is we looked at, well, we broke the Australian economy into 5 main sectors: electricity, buildings, transport, industry, and agriculture and land. And as I mentioned earlier, there's some technologies that are demonstrated and mature, kind of ready to go, and then some that are emerging and that still require a little bit more research and development. these are just a few examples. What we did was our report reviews all the major emissions reduction technologies and solutions available. And what we've found is the progress achieved in the last 5 years has closed the technical gap that zero emissions is achievable across all sectors, or at least net zero with some offsetting. In electricity and buildings, zero emissions is doable with technologies that are already available now. In electricity, as I said, this means renewables, storage, and what we call demand management, which is kind of changing the levels of electricity use at different times of the day. A combination of those can get to zero emissions. In buildings, deep energy efficiency and electrification combined with 100% renewable electricity grid can get us to zero emissions. So energy efficiency, that's things like LED lighting, double glazed windows, heating and ventilation systems that are efficient, and then electrification, so electrified cooking and electrified heat pumps rather than gas, hot water, things like that. In transport, the solutions are at different levels depending on the modes of transport. So cars can be fully decarbonised now using electric vehicles if they're powered by 100% renewable electricity. When we get to freight transport, things like big trucks, freight rail and aviation, it's a little bit trickier. Electric solutions are emerging. So there's short haul plane flights that are electric now, there's ferries that are electric, and there's trucks that are electric. But there's an issue of what we call kind of range. Currently there isn't electric trucks that can drive for the 10, 11 hours and things like that are needed. And so there's a range of those zero emissions fuels that are more appropriate than electrifying. So this is things like biofuels, which is fuels generated from crops, and other biomass, which is just things developed in the natural environment, hydrogen and ammonia and other alternative fuels. In industry and agriculture, this is where there's the most work to be done. There is new solutions, in particular renewable hydrogen, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, which could become a very large export market for Australia, and it can also power a lot of industrial processes. So currently we use fossil fuels and gas for what's called industrial heat. So the heat that's required for big manufacturing and things like that. And if we can generate renewable hydrogen, which requires water and electricity, if done renewably, then that could be used as a replacement. And agriculture and land and industry, these are the ones that, when I mentioned that what we need to do is spend the next 10 years, the rest of this decade, doing the last bits of research and development so that they're really ready to deploy from 2030 onwards. So I've talked about some positives since 2014 when we did our first research, which was that technology has progressed far greater than we ever expected. One development over those last 5 years that hasn't been as positive is the trend in global emissions, which have kept increasing over that period. And what this means is that we've lost very valuable time, and that the decrease towards zero emissions needs to be a lot steeper now than it would have been if we started action 10 or 20 years ago. What this graph shows is the remaining global carbon budgets for 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming. Some of you may not be familiar with the concept of a carbon budget. So in short, global temperature rise is based on the total amount of carbon in the atmosphere, rather than the point at which we get to net zero, even though they are very linked. So the carbon budget corresponds to the cumulative amount, the total amount of emissions we're allowed to put into the atmosphere before we reach certain temperature levels. So while net zero by 2050 is often stated as the goal to keep temperature rise below 2 degrees, it also matters what the emissions are between now and then. So we can't keep doing what we're doing until 2040, 2045, and then by then have these amazing technologies that can just bring emissions to zero. Slightly scary statistics here that we have a good chance of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. We're currently at about 1.1 degrees. The remaining global carbon budget is 336 gigatons of emissions. This corresponds to about 8 years worth of emissions at current rates. Slightly less scary, to have a good chance of keeping global warming below 2 degrees, though there is significant difference in climate impacts between 1.5 and 2 degrees. The remaining global carbon budget is a bit more than 1,000 gigatons, and this corresponds to about 26 years worth of emissions at current rates. So what this shows you is that we need to start the journey towards zero emissions as soon as possible, and we need to reverse the trends that we're seeing. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to walk through our modelling results, which is showing in these scenarios in which we get to net zero by 2050, aligned to those 1.5 and 2 degree pathways. What we saw, what were the changes and things that we saw in the economy. So we modelled 3 scenarios, the 3 that are on your screen. One's called 2 degrees deploy, one's called 2 degrees innovate, and one's called 1.5 degrees all in. 2 degrees deploy focuses on the accelerated deployment of technologies that are mature and ready to go. And this is achieved through particularly strong policy action. And so the way we develop these scenarios is across the sectors and across hundreds of different, what would we call them, metrics or slight changes, whether that's in sort of business and individual behaviour, whether that's in government policies, whether that's in what technologies can be used and when and what their costs are and all of that sort of things. We develop these scenarios, which is essentially a vision of how the world looks like, and in this case, how Australia looks like. And the idea is in these scenarios, there needs to be a kind of internal logic. So things all need to make sense. And then we try that. We've run hundreds of different scenarios, changing things slightly this way and slightly that way. We've come up with these 3. And by no means is the point of this to develop a prescription to say that, we think that this is exactly the path Australia should go down. What we're looking at is exploring what the different avenues that Australia could go down that would be aligned to Australia's Paris goals. So that I mentioned the 2 degree deploy. For 2 degrees innovate, we modelled kind of technological improvements at the upper bound of current expectations. So really pushing the frontier of what's available. And the action is driven by supportive policy and demands for businesses and industry. And then the 1.5 degree all-in scenario is when policy, technological innovation, businesses and individuals, firing on all cylinders, everything's going in the direction it should, and then we limit emissions to a level compatible with a 1.5 degrees increase. Now, before I get into what these look like, a couple of disclaimers. All 3 scenarios assume typical economic conditions. And so we didn't model or look at dramatic structural changes to Australia's economy, or for example, fundamentally people travelling less, or fundamentally different styles of government, anything like that. That's beyond the scope of the work, but it does have an important role to play in the broader climate conversation. We haven't included a couple of new industries. So I mentioned renewable hydrogen. There's a few others, these kind of industries that Australia might develop in the coming years because of our natural resources. While we modelled a little bit of, say, the use of hydrogen, we were not looking at, how Australia could develop these brand new industries large scale. We're just looking at kind of, existing activity and existing economic behaviour and people's behaviour. And the last one, and I mentioned at the beginning, and I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end, that all of this was done prior to COVID-19. And so we haven't modelled any of the sort of impacts from that, but I'll talk about those, as I said, at the end. What our scenario analysis shows at a fundamental level is that Australia can achieve trajectories compatible with the Paris climate goals. It is within our technological ability, it's within our cost structures, it's within kind of the way that we live and act at the moment. But it shows that those trajectories involve very strong emissions reductions, particularly in the next decade. Things really have to start picking up pace. We see about 50% reduction below 2005 levels in 2030 for the 2-degree scenarios, and about 75% reduction below 2005 levels in the 1.5-degree scenario. For scale and context, the federal government's current target is 26 to 28% below 2005 targets. So we're talking about a double or triple emissions reduction on that. So these 3 graphs represent emissions by sector, by those 5 main sectors that I mentioned that we broke the economy down into. Their emissions for each of the 3 scenarios. The yellow dotted line shows emissions for electricity, but electricity emissions are counted in the different colours. So any electricity used in buildings, for example, is in those purple parts of the shape. And the red dotted line or the orange dotted line represents total emissions in Australia. So there's a number of similarities and differences, and draw attention to this because it's this is where you really see some interesting information, is when we try these different scenarios where lots of different things happen, but if there's similarities across all of them, that's really important, because we can basically say not necessarily just that this needs to happen, but that, this seems to be the way that the economy is going regardless, maybe not at the speed that we want, but yeah, and there's 2 examples there. One being electricity emissions moves to 100% renewables by 2050 in all the scenarios. So electricity, renewables replace fossil fuel generation, coal and gas-fired generation, in all the scenarios, and not just these 3 that we published. The other is a dramatic uptake of electric vehicles. As I said, they're getting a lot cheaper very quickly, and that seems to be something that, regardless of how many different levers we changed, is something that happens across all different scenarios. You'll also see that electricity, buildings and transport all basically get to 0 emissions by 2050. Industry and agriculture are the ones that have what we call residual emissions, so still having emissions in 2050, and those need to be offset. When I say offset, what that currently means in Australia is carbon forestry, which means planting new trees to essentially suck carbon from the atmosphere. So people offset their flights. A lot of companies will offset their emissions, because if their emissions go above a certain level, the government charges them for it. So that's currently what offsetting means in almost all cases, is via carbon forestry. There are kind of newer examples, things what we call soil carbon, which is a way in which you can get the soil to suck carbon out of the atmosphere, something called blue carbon, which I'm personally not very familiar with, but it's using the ocean. And so these are this is the current way that we offset emissions. Australia has a huge potential for that due to our really large amount of available land. But Australia's land use needs to be balanced between carbon, water, biodiversity, food crops, urban development, and so on. And our forests are also very vulnerable, as we've just seen this past summer, to bushfires, which can impact the viability of carbon plantings. And we expect to see that that vulnerability will increase as well as temperature increases. So in these scenarios, we have, especially in the 1.5 degree scenario, we have quite a lot of carbon forestry or carbon sequestration more generally that could be achieved in different ways. But we really don't want to rely on this, and we want to try and reduce emissions as much as possible without it. In terms of differences between the scenarios, the differences are really around, in electricity, the rate at which coal-powered electricity generation gets retired. It's the slowest in the Innovate scenario, and in that scenario, electricity only gets to zero emissions by 2050. In the others, it happens by 2035. And then there's a couple of others which I'll get to as I go through the individual sectors. So I'm just going to very briefly talk to each sector one by one. This is as technical as I'll get tonight. And normally audiences, there's half the room that find it very interesting and the other not so much. So it won't take too long. And as I said, I can explain anything I go through at the end if you have questions. So for electricity, as I mentioned, it's all about renewable generation. Renewables contribute about 75% of generation by 2030 and 100% by 2050 in all scenarios. There's a few things to think about here. So if renewables generate more than about 50% or so of the electricity grid, which is what we want to see very quickly, there's things that need to be thought about in terms of making sure that the grid is able to handle that, because the way in which it generates electricity is a little bit different than coal and other fossil fuel generation. So there's something that needs to get thought about, and collaboration and work together between the governments and energy providers and people like that. And this renewable generation, in Australia, it's predominantly wind and solar. In other countries, hydro and things like geothermal and wave technology are actually the best ways of generating electricity. But in Australia, it's predominantly wind and solar. And you'll see that dark yellow at the top is rooftop solar on homes and businesses and public buildings. It might not look like there's a dramatic increase in that, but it actually is quite significant between now and, say, in 10 years or 20 years, the amount of buildings that have that on. And again, it's really important. Electricity is arguably the most important, though it's the most mature in the sense that we can get emissions to zero quite easily. A lot of the other sectors getting to zero emissions really relies on switching to electricity, and that electricity being zero emissions. So if you get an electric vehicle now and power it by the electricity grid, it still has emissions. It has less than if you have a petrol car, though 5 years ago in Victoria, actually that wasn't the case. So to really make it feasible for other sectors to switch to electricity, you need the electricity grid to be renewables quite quickly. In buildings, you might notice that the shape of those curves is quite similar to the orange curve of electricity, and that's because of what I just mentioned, that the majority of buildings are already electric, and we expect that to become more and more the case as people switch to electric appliances, and these are rapidly improving in performance and reducing in cost. They're as cheap, if not cheaper than gas in residential, commercial. There's still a little bit to go for kind of larger scale heating and things like that. But yeah, it is really all about electricity. Buildings are also interesting because, as I mentioned, they're likely to be the site of a significant share of renewable energy generation because of rooftop solar. And going forward, there's the opportunity to do some interesting things such as electric vehicles. Electric vehicles, if parked, say, in the garage overnight, can actually act as batteries. So they can actually store electricity themselves and give it back to the grid. And so what I talked about earlier, that if we've got a lot of renewables in the electricity grid, you need a lot of batteries to store that so that it can be stored and then used when needed. Electric vehicles in a home, for example, can actually play that role without needing additional storage. So there's kind of a killing two birds with one stone thing that can happen there. But it's not all about kind of brand new things. There's lots of energy efficiency that buildings can do right now. There's a massive opportunity to do things like I mentioned, like LED lights, improving the kind of drafting and insulation in buildings, switching over to heat pumps and things like that, that now have really short payback periods that can be cost effective over a 4 or 5 year period, if not earlier. I'll go quickly through these last three sectors. Transport, again, it's very much about electrification. What we do see is that transport emissions keep going up for the next 5 years or so as electric vehicles come on. And then after that, we start to see a pretty dramatic reduction. For other transport modes, apart from road transport, it's a little bit harder. And so we don't see emissions from them decreasing until about 2030 or so, which is when I said, we need these next 10 years to kind of do the research and demonstration so that after that we can start to deploy things like alternative fuels in planes, trains, and water transport. Industry is probably the most complicated sector because what we call industry encapsulates a huge number of things. It's creations of metals, utilities, light manufacturing, construction, chemicals, all these sorts of things. And they all have very different emissions profiles and they all have very different solutions. So I won't spend too much time here because it is very varied beyond depending on the subsector. But what we do see is that we can reduce industry emissions by about 80% by 2050 and then offset the last part. And we do expect that if we were to do this again in 5 years, there would be the technology to reduce by 100%. There's just a few things that we weren't confident enough to be able to say this is 100% ready to go to reduce all emissions. Lastly, and maybe one of the most interesting, at least to me, is in agriculture. So as I mentioned, there's a large source of agricultural emissions is from livestock and from the methane produced by dairy cattle, sheep and beef cattle from their burping and farting that produces methane that is a strong emission. And we're kind of right on the cusp of kind of the research around that and developing solutions to that. So as you'll see in 2 of those 3 graphs on your screen, there's a significant drop in emissions between 2025 and 2030, and there's not in the deploy scenario. And that's all about whether we've developed a anti-methane vaccine or solution. And yeah, it is right on that cusp of knowing whether it's going to be ready to go by 2025 or not. Meat and Livestock Australia, the large kind of industry group for the red meat industry, have a target of being carbon neutral by 2030. So it's not out of the ballpark. It's something that the sector is working really strongly to try and achieve. And if it is, and if it's ready in the next 5 to 10 years, it'll be able to reduce emissions very quickly. And there's a few options for what that could be. The most kind of mature of them is a form of seaweed, a red seaweed that essentially neutralizes the methane when you include it in the feed that you feed animals. And there's a couple of other little things in there more around agricultural practices, things like fertilizer and manure management, more efficient agricultural techniques, and other things like that that can reduce other emissions. So there's kind of two main takeaway messages. One being that in all our scenarios, what we see is much faster deployment of these emissions reduction technologies, even the ones that are mature, than is what we would expect under business as usual. So for example, the government currently projects that about 1 in 5 cars will be electric by 2030. Our scenarios see about 1 in 2 by 2030, or in the ambitious 1.5 degree scenario, 3 in 4. And again, with renewables and electricity generation, as I said, we really want to see that taken up quite quickly, in the order of 70 to 80% by 2030. The government projects that it'll be at about 50. So in those kind of mature situations, it's all about accelerating how fast things get out. And then that kind of the two-speed story, the other half of the story is the research and experimentation and development and demonstration of kind of these emerging solutions, hydrogen, biofuels, and kind of, meat substitutes, or those treatments for anti-methane. So in short, this is a story we often tell that we missed our chance to start reducing emissions in the last decade, which was what was often called the critical decade for climate, and now we've entered what we're calling the transformational decade. So in order to stay within global 1.5 and 2 degree goals, emissions need to head towards zero at a very steep pace. And the good news is that we can do this, that the solutions are there. They just need to be deployed a lot quicker. Now, as I said, the modelling that we did, those scenarios were conducted prior to COVID-19. So a question a lot of people ask is, how is the current pandemic, what's the interaction between that and climate change and emissions and the task of getting towards net zero? You may have seen reports in the news of COVID-19's impact on transport and other activity, leading to lower emissions and lower air pollution. The Himalayas were visible from Punjab in India for the first time in 30 years, and other things like that. There has been a global reduction in emissions, but it hasn't been a dramatic one. So aviation emissions in Australia dropped about 40% between January and May. Global emissions declined. This was kind of the peak, was 17%. On April 7, 2020, it was 17% lower than it was in April 7th, 2019. And the estimated overall decline for 2020 is in the ballpark of 4 to 7%, depending on how long restrictions persist around the world. So 7%, that's not nothing, that's substantial. But for scale, it would bring us back roughly to 2011 levels, whereas the change needed to keep temperature rise below 2 degrees, as we've just talked about, is much greater than that. And what we're seeing is this emissions reductions, the transport systems coming to a standstill, is likely to be temporary. And unless this crisis provides a disruption to our activities that can get catalysed into long-term change, then we'll likely see a return to pre-COVID emissions levels pretty quickly. And this has already been seen in China and New Zealand. But there are things like reduced travel, increased use of bikes and walking, working from home. These are trends that could become new norms, and government action and business action and individuals can fortify this, and hopefully this will develop some new activity changes and patterns that reduce emissions. But what we at ClimateWorks see as the more crucial way in which COVID-19 could impact the climate crisis is through the economic packages and measures that governments around the world are announcing and enacting as part of their recovery measures. So government spending in the wake of the COVID crisis will be the largest government spending in Australia in the history of the country. And it's going to shape the economy for decades to come, for better or worse. You may have seen this is an op-ed that was in The Age on Saturday by Kevin Rudd and Patrick Suckling. The rhetoric here might not be the most constructive, but it does draw attention to the significant opportunity to redirect the economy that we've been presented. And there's a global conversation around the world for what's being called a green recovery. People like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the International Energy Agency, as well as presidents, CEOs, mayors around the world have been calling for governments to seize the opportunity to scale up emissions reduction efforts as part of their economic packages. The important point that we want to drive home here is that the economy and the climate are not in a state of trade-off. Many of the actions we identified in decarbonisation futures can support efforts to rebuild the economy post-COVID. There's some examples on the right-hand side there of solutions that we see in our scenarios, things like upgrading buildings, deploying more renewables for electricity, rolling out electric vehicle charging stations, those carbon forestry, planting trees, increased recycling, things like this will create jobs, a lot of them quite quickly in industries that have been impacted by the crisis, so construction, for example, or in the case of carbon forestry, regional communities affected by the loss of tourism. And these will also deliver benefits to individuals and businesses, lower energy bills in the case of building upgrades, improved health outcomes, and there's also, new industries that will come from the transition to net zero emissions, things like renewable hydrogen. Australia has large lithium resources that are needed for batteries for electric vehicles. Things like this, these new industries that the government and the private sector could invest in that will get us towards net zero at the same time as generating new export markets and other things that the governments are very keen on doing at the moment as part of the recovery. So if that's sort of what needs to happen or what can happen in Australia, what's the role of the different levels of government and the role of the rest of us in the community and the private sector as well? The take home is that the transition is not going to happen without actions from all parties, governments, businesses and individuals. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of government, but I just want to talk briefly now about what can you do as an individual to reduce emissions and kind of shift the system ever so slightly, each person in the direction that we want. So if we're looking at this list on the right-hand side, we've got shift in consumption. And it's things like, for electricity, you can switch your provider to a lower emissions provider, people like PowerShop and others. For transport, switching your car to electric or just a more fuel efficient vehicle. For industry, purchasing less to reduce demand and then shifting your demand away from high carbon products. If you're building a house, you may look at recycled materials. Agriculture and land, it's about purchasing power, so maybe reducing your red meat intake or looking to other protein sources. In terms of behaviour, shifts in behaviour, this is predominantly buildings and transport, using less electricity and gas, turning off your lights, having shorter showers. For transport, it's driving less, catching public transport more, flying less, purchasing offsets for the flights that you do take. Home upgrades, this is, buildings, installing efficient shower heads, LED lights, putting solar PV panels, electrifying your cooking, and so on. The next one's shift in investments that I think is a really important one, which is, the people that you bank with, the people that you have your superannuation with, or if you have investments in shares, you do have the power to shift those to those who have divested from fossil fuels, in the case of banks and super, or companies who have, or if you are invested in companies and corporations, shifting to those that have lower emissions profiles or have clear transition strategies. So you could look at the things in that list for businesses. Are companies shifting their products? Do they have targets on their emissions? Or, are they really engaging with their investors around matters of climate? Are they showing that they're deeply engaged in this? And that can give you a guide on your investments if you have them. I'll come back to advocacy in a moment. Just the last two, paying a price premium. This acknowledges that a lot of what I just mentioned in terms of shifting consumption behavior, home upgrades, and so on, that a lot of these cost money or is otherwise unfeasible for some in the community, but there are those with greater discretionary income or spending power who can overcome those barriers, especially, things like EVs, electric vehicles, or, plant-based meat substitutes for food. These are more expensive now and they won't be in the long term. But what they need to get to the long term is to develop economies of scale and to develop bigger markets. So those that do have the ability to pay a price premium can do that to not only enjoy the products themselves, but to generate momentum in those industries. Community investment, this is not my area of expertise, but we're predominantly referring to community renewable energy generation projects. There's quite a few of them in Australia, particularly in regional Australia and places like Southeast Queensland, where a number of houses and businesses can connect together to a centralised renewable energy resource, a small array of solar panels or something like that, and then share the electricity. And some states and local governments do provide funding support for endeavours like this. The last one is advocacy. So I think it's worth recognising that a lot of what I've talked about, as I said, costs money and isn't always possible. And so one of the most powerful actions you do have in the community is advocating for change at the different levels of government or at the level of companies in the corporate sector, if so inclined. So I just want to talk a little bit about what the remit of responsibility for different levels of government is, that can hopefully equip you a little on knowing, what is possible and for whom it's possible to do. So what this table here presents is some of the key areas over which the different levels of government have legislative power. This is by no means exhaustive or comprehensive, but should give you a general sense. While this power does generally designate the domain in which different governments act, it doesn't preclude them from taking actions in other areas. So, for example, the federal government often provide funding to the states and territories for things like infrastructure and roads and railways that is predominantly under the state control. The important story here again is that the emissions reduction task is shared by all. While clear long-term direction from the federal government would provide certainty for state and local jurisdictions, there's still a lot that can be done by these governments to reduce emissions in their operations in the community. It's also worth noting that emissions reductions in some cases, and I'll go through a quick case study towards the end, require cross-jurisdictional collaboration. So one quick example now is that in the electricity sector, Victoria is part of the national electricity market, and that's all states and territories except for Western Australia and Northern Territory. So this market is shared by all these states and territories, and to get renewables above about 70% in the grid, that's going to require changing certain regulations and changing rules around the market, and that is going to require agreement. That's going to require the states and territories and the federal government to come together to agree on something. And these are some of the areas in which different governments can impact the community emissions, the societal emissions. It's worth noting that they all have the ability to reduce their operational emissions from buildings and vehicle fleets, as well as, the goods and services they procure. So, whether that be construction materials for new buildings or infrastructure, or, say in the case of states, state governments, they have control over the food that they procure for things like hospitals and prisons and in some cases schools. So there's kind of these two main categories of community emissions and then operational emissions. Given we're here as part of a local council event, I just want to talk a little bit more in detail around local governments. So again, not an exhaustive list by any means, but here on screen is a few cases of how local governments can reduce their own emissions. Things like procuring energy from renewable sources, phasing out gas, installing energy efficient streetlights, transitioning the vehicle fleet and so on. That's the kind of operational emissions. And then in community emissions, it's things like waste. So there's kind of waste can get converted to energy through waste to energy developments. And then kind of urban planning processes. In some cases, the local government has some jurisdictional power. And then, encouraging behaviour and action through programs and educations and things like that. I'll draw your attention to what I mentioned at the beginning, which was our local government report, Net Zero Momentum Tracker local government report on our website. If you want to read more, we kind of talk a little bit more in detail around the local government level and that jurisdiction's kind of remit of responsibility. To end things, I just want to go through two case studies that I think are interesting in the sense of their cases in which local government's role interacts with other jurisdictions like the state government. And shows kind of both the bounds and then also the kind of interesting ways in which jurisdictional power can change or shift, or momentum can get brought in innovative or interesting ways. So some of you may have seen this in the news back in May as part of Yarra City Council's climate emergency plan. They're proposing this idea that all new commercial and residential buildings in the council area be net zero in order to receive planning approval. Now, this sounds great in theory, but does require changing the council's planning scheme to be amended. And this requires sign-off from the Minister of Planning and the state government. So local government doesn't have complete control over this. And it's yet to be agreed on as far as I'm aware. But as kind of part of this process, Yarra has also been in discussion with other councils to kind of generate momentum towards this goal. And one outcome that we've talked about at ClimateWorks that could be envisioned on the back of this is that the state government decides to kind of make a jurisdictional guideline that going forward, local governments are allowed, if they would like, completely voluntary, to set such guidelines. And so basically the state government might choose, we're going to hand the power over to the local governments to make this choice. And so this is, this is a complicated space where it's not exactly clear who has total, it's kind of this jostling and back and forth between different jurisdictions. So I think that's interesting case. Another thing that I think is interesting in the Yarra Council example is they are planning to electrify and use 100% renewable electricity. And the way they're doing this is through a PPA, which is a power purchasing agreement, which is, in some cases, it's not appropriate to put solar PVs on every building for different reasons, for cost reasons. Some buildings don't have enough roof space, things like that, in which case, to power by renewable electricity, your best option is this, what's called a power purchasing agreement, which is a direct agreement between a generator and yourself for the sale and supply of a particular amount of energy. The thing is, PPAs normally aren't signed for small cases. It's normally either for very large companies or, for example, the Victorian state government have a PPA to power all of Melbourne's trams. But what the City of Melbourne have done is this thing, you can Google it if you're more interested, called the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project, where what they do is they bring together a consortium of multiple public and private sector groups for a single PPA contract. So again, this is a case where the local government probably on their own couldn't achieve that kind of 100% renewable generation, but through collaboration with others was able to. And the last case that I wanted to draw attention to is not within Australia. It's the Chicago City Council in the US in April passed an ordinance that required all new construction of residential buildings with 5 or more units and on-site parking, or any commercial property with 30 or more parking spaces, to have 1 in 5 of those parking spaces ready for electric vehicle charging. There isn't many cases of this around the world, and you'd have to check the exact planning codes in Victoria, whether this is something that local councils can do, or whether it would be something that the state government requires as part of their remit over planning. But the reason I bring this up is electric vehicles is an interesting case where we can kind of exhibit the roles that all levels of government can play to kind of, really flip the switch and make that kind of system level change of our vehicle fleets. So at the federal government level, the federal government could do, for example, could implement a ban on the sale of all new petrol vehicles from 2035. This is what Boris Johnson has done in the UK. It's something that the federal government could potentially do. We're not saying that that's necessarily the correct way of about doing it, but they could do this sort of thing that would provide a kind of longer term overarching vision for the country and some certainty. Then at the state government level, state governments don't have the ability to change the price of electric cars, but they have a remit over registration fees. That's part of their responsibility. And in Victoria, registration fees are different depending on types of vehicles and efficiency and things like that. They could set a differential registration fee for electric vehicles. And that would, at their level, able to encourage the switch to an electric car. They can't make the whole thing happen themselves, but they can, push the lever forward a little bit. And then at the local government level, if possible, can do things around their requirements for buildings to have charging points. And what you see there, and then say all 3 jurisdictions of government all switch their vehicle fleets to electric as well, what you start to see is you see multiple levers being pulled and working in tandem. And this is the sort of, this is the sort of things that need to happen to really have the system level change. It needs to be kind of, within everyone's remit of ability to flip the switch the little bit that they're able to do. which comes back to the overall point, which is that, you know, this is the transformational decade for climate, and really requires mobilization and change from parties at all levels, and that's what's going to be needed to create the system level change that's required.